June 19th, 1944. The Philippine Sea, west of Guam. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stands on the bridge of carrier Taiho, watching the sunrise paint the Pacific horizon in shades of crimson and gold. Around him, the largest Japanese carrier striking force assembled since Midway prepares to launch 430 aircraft against the American Fifth Fleet, 9 carriers. 430 of Japan's finest naval aviators, one final chance to destroy American naval power before it reaches the home islands. By sunset, 380 of those aircraft will be gone. Not destroyed by American fighters, not lost to operational accidents, obliterated by artillery shells that think for themselves. Shells that hunt Japanese aircraft through the sky like electronic bloodhounds, detonating with mathematical precision at exactly 70 feet from their targets. American gunners will fire fewer than 10,000 rounds to achieve what would have required 500,000 shells just 2 years earlier. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Japanese Navy called them Bakudan Ma, demon shells. American sailors had a simpler name, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Admiral Ozawa had spent 3 months planning this operation. His intelligence officers assured him that American anti-aircraft effectiveness remained manageable, requiring concentrated attacks from multiple directions to saturate defensive fire. Japanese doctrine emphasized coordinated strikes, waves of aircraft attacking simultaneously to overwhelm enemy gunners through sheer numbers. The mathematics seemed sound. Even highly skilled American crews needed time to acquire targets, calculate firing solutions, and reload their weapons. Sufficient attacking aircraft would inevitably penetrate the defensive screen. What Ozawa did not know, what Japanese intelligence had completely failed to identify, was that American anti-aircraft technology had undergone a revolution more profound than any tactical innovation in naval warfare history. Every major American warship now carried ammunition that Japanese planners believed impossible. Shells containing miniature radar transmitters that could detect aircraft and detonate automatically at optimal range. No human timing calculations, no mechanical fuses requiring precise range estimation, just electromagnetic waves that sensed the presence of aluminum airframes and triggered explosions with inhuman precision. The technology had been America's most closely guarded secret for 2 years, more classified than radar installations, more secret than even early atomic research. Admiral Chester Nimitz had forbidden any written documentation of the weapon's capabilities. Ships carrying proximity, fused ammunition operated under orders to destroy their magazines rather than allow capture. Undetonated shells that fell into the ocean triggered immediate recovery operations using diving teams and underwater detection equipment. The entire Pacific Fleet understood one absolute rule: these weapons must never fall into Japanese hands. Commander Haruo Yoshino led the first strike wave, 169 aircraft arranged in precise formations that Japanese doctrine considered optimal for penetrating American defensive screens. His Zero fighters would suppress anti-aircraft fire, while dive bombers and torpedo planes attacked the American carriers. The plan had worked at Pearl Harbor, at the Coral Sea, at dozens of smaller engagements across the Pacific. Yoshino had personally trained for this mission for 8 months, studying American defensive patterns and practicing coordinated attack approaches. At 0830 hours, his formation approached Task Force 58 from the northwest, maintaining tight spacing that would allow simultaneous attacks against multiple American ships. Yoshino could see the enemy fleet clearly now, 15 carriers arranged in circular formations with their screening destroyers and cruisers creating protective rings around the vulnerable flight decks. The Americans had detected his approach. Their radar had undoubtedly been tracking his formation for the past 40 minutes. But radar alone could not stop aircraft. It merely provided early warning. The first American shells began exploding at 20,000 yards, far beyond the effective range Yoshino had been taught to expect from American 5-inch guns. Brilliant white flashes appeared directly in the path of his formation. Not the usual black smoke bursts of time-fused shells that detonated at predetermined intervals, but precisely positioned explosions that seemed to anticipate his aircraft's exact locations. Within seconds, 3 Zeros disintegrated as shrapnel tore through their fuel tanks and engine cowlings. Yoshino immediately ordered evasive maneuvers, breaking his tight formation to scatter his aircraft across a wider defensive pattern. Japanese tactical doctrine taught that dispersed formations reduced casualties from anti-aircraft fire by presenting multiple targets that gunners could not simultaneously engage. But the American shells followed his aircraft through their evasive turns, detonating with the same deadly precision regardless of altitude changes or directional shifts. It was as if the shells could see his planes, tracking them through the sky and exploding at exactly the moment they came within lethal range. More aircraft began falling. Not one or two lost to lucky shots, but entire sections disappearing in clusters of white explosions that walked through his formation like the footsteps of an invisible giant. Yoshino's radio filled with frantic reports from his surviving pilots. Shells exploding without warning. No visible gun flashes to identify firing ships. No predictable burst patterns that pilots could avoid through tactical maneuvering. Just constant, accurate, devastating fire that destroyed everything it touched. By the time Yoshino's formation closed to 10,000 yards, he had lost 74 aircraft, nearly half his striking force gone before a single bomb had been released or torpedo launched. The survivors pressed their attacks with the courage that Japanese naval aviation demanded, but their coordinated assault had dissolved into individual suicide runs by isolated aircraft attempting to reach targets through walls of exploding steel. Lieutenant Zenji Abe dove his Val bomber through a gap in the American defensive fire, releasing his 500-pound bomb at 1,500 feet before pulling up sharply to escape. He felt the shockwave as 3 proximity-fused shells detonated simultaneously around his aircraft, shredding his left wing and destroying his hydraulic system. The bomber rolled inverted and plunged into the Pacific, carrying Abe and his radioman to deaths they never saw coming. Yoshino himself survived only through blind luck. A sudden altitude change to avoid a damaged friendly aircraft carried his Zero through a gap in the defensive fire, just as proximity-fused shells bracketed his previous position. He watched the brilliant explosions in his rearview mirror, understanding with absolute certainty that American technology had advanced far beyond anything Japanese intelligence had predicted. These were not improved guns or better training. This was something fundamentally different, something that changed the basic mathematics of naval air warfare. Of the 169 aircraft in Yoshino's strike wave, only 42 returned to their carriers, 127 aircraft lost, 800 Japanese aircrew dead, casualties that exceeded anything in Japanese naval aviation history, and the Americans reported minimal damage. 1 destroyer hit by a single bomb that failed to penetrate its armored deck. 1 carrier struck by a kamikaze attack that caused superficial damage to its flight deck. Admiral Ozawa received these reports with growing disbelief. His battle plan had assumed acceptable losses of perhaps 20 to 30% during the initial strike. The mathematics of carrier warfare demanded such sacrifices to achieve decisive results, but 75% casualties before reaching their targets made coordinated attacks impossible. No naval air force could sustain such losses and continue offensive operations. The second Japanese strike wave launched at 1100 hours. 130 aircraft following the same approach routes Yoshino's survivors had just flown. They encountered the same devastating defensive fire. Proximity-fused shells that detonated with mechanical precision around every aircraft that entered their engagement range. This time, American gunners were fully prepared, their radar tracking systems identifying incoming formations, while directors calculated optimal firing solutions. 109 aircraft lost. 21 survivors straggling back to their carriers with damage and casualties that rendered many unflyable for future operations. Japanese aircrew, who had trained for years to master the complex skills of carrier aviation, were dying faster than training programs could replace them. The mathematical reality was undeniable. American defensive fire had achieved effectiveness levels that made conventional air attacks suicidal. Petty Officer First Class Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's highest-scoring aces with over 60 confirmed victories, participated in the third strike wave that afternoon. He had survived combat from China to the Solomon Islands through a combination of exceptional skill and tactical awareness that kept him alive when thousands of his comrades had died. But even Sakai's experience could not overcome the brutal physics of proximity-fused ammunition. His formation approached the American fleet at 18,000 feet, hoping altitude would provide some protection against the shells that had devastated the earlier strikes. It made no difference. The proximity fuses worked equally well at high altitude, their radio transmitters detecting aircraft regardless of height and detonating at optimal range with the same deadly precision. Sakai watched two of his wingmen disintegrate in simultaneous explosions that gave them no time to react or evade. He dove toward the ocean, using speed and violent maneuvering to break through the wall of exploding shells. His Zero took multiple shrapnel hits that destroyed his radio and damaged his engine cowling, but Sakai's luck held one final time. He escaped the engagement zone and limped back toward the Japanese fleet, his aircraft trailing smoke and oil from a dozen penetrating hits. Back aboard carrier Zuikaku, Sakai reported what every surviving Japanese pilot was now saying. American anti-aircraft fire had become impossible to penetrate. The shells seemed to possess supernatural awareness, detonating precisely when aircraft came within killing range, regardless of altitude, speed, or evasive maneuvers. Japanese aircrew, who had never shown fear in combat, now spoke openly about the futility of attacking American ships equipped with these demonic weapons. Admiral Ozawa faced the devastating reality during the evening hours of June 19th. He had launched 430 aircraft against Task Force 58. 315 were confirmed lost. Another 47 were too damaged to fly again without extensive repairs. The largest Japanese carrier airstrike since Midway had been destroyed without achieving any significant damage to American forces. The mathematics were simple and devastating. The Imperial Japanese Navy no longer possessed the capability to conduct offensive carrier operations against American forces. What Ozawa could not know, what Japanese intelligence would not discover until after the war ended, was the specific technology that had destroyed his air groups with such devastating efficiency. The proximity fuse remained classified at levels that prevented even high-ranking American officers from discussing its operational details. Japanese analysts correctly deduced that American shells were using some form of automated detection system, but they failed to identify the radar-based technology that made such precision possible. Japanese technical intelligence officers examined fragments recovered from unexploded American shells, finding vacuum tubes and electronic components that suggested radio transmitters. But they could not understand how such delicate equipment could survive the 20,000 G forces of artillery launch, or how miniature radar sets could function reliably while spinning at 25,000 revolutions per minute inside a projectile traveling at half a mile per second. The technology seemed to violate everything Japanese engineers understood about both electronics and artillery. Vacuum tubes were fragile laboratory instruments that shattered when dropped. Radio transmitters required stable platforms and careful calibration. The idea of combining these incompatible technologies inside an artillery shell struck Japanese scientists as physically impossible, suggesting that American claims about their anti-aircraft capabilities must be propaganda or exaggeration. But the casualty statistics told a different story. Japanese naval aviation losses in the Pacific Theater had increased exponentially since early 1943, precisely when American ships began receiving proximity-fused ammunition. Aircraft that had once attacked American vessels with reasonable chances of survival now faced near-certain destruction when attempting similar missions. The technological gap was widening with every engagement, transforming American defensive superiority into an overwhelming advantage that Japanese forces could not overcome through training, tactics, or courage. Captain Tamechi Hara, commanding destroyer Shigure, witnessed the aftermath of the Philippine Sea disaster from his position, with Ozawa's screening force. His ship had survived dozens of combat engagements since the war's beginning through a combination of luck and competent seamanship that kept Shigure functional while sister ships were being sunk around her. But Hara understood that Japanese naval power was dying not from lack of courage or inadequate training, but from American technological superiority that Japanese industry could not match. The proximity fuse represented more than improved ammunition. It embodied American industrial capacity applied to warfare's most challenging technical problems. While Japanese factories struggled to produce adequate quantities of conventional weapons, American industry was mass manufacturing electronic devices more complex than commercial radios and installing them in artillery shells by the hundreds of thousands. The industrial disparity was as decisive as any tactical innovation, demonstrating that modern warfare had become as much about manufacturing capability as battlefield courage. Night fell over the Philippine Sea, bringing temporary relief from the day's slaughter. Japanese carriers recovered their surviving aircraft, counting losses that exceeded anything in naval aviation history. Flight deck crews prepared aircraft for operations the following day, but everyone understood the mission would be futile. Attacking American ships had become a form of elaborate suicide, achieving nothing beyond adding more names to casualty lists that already stretched beyond counting. Admiral Ozawa composed his report to Combined Fleet Headquarters in deliberately vague language that could not fully convey the scope of the disaster. 315 aircraft lost. Minimal damage inflicted on enemy forces. Continuation of offensive operations not feasible with remaining air strength. The words captured the tactical reality, without explaining the underlying cause. How could he report that American shells had achieved the impossible, thinking for themselves and hunting Japanese aircraft through the sky with electronic precision that rendered conventional tactics obsolete? The Battle of the Philippine Sea marked the effective end of Japanese naval aviation as an offensive force. The carriers that had dominated the Pacific in 1942 now sailed without adequate air groups to defend themselves, let alone attack enemy forces. The proximity fuse had achieved what years of conventional combat could not. It had transformed the fundamental mathematics of naval warfare, making aircraft attacks against well-defended ships mathematically suicidal, regardless of pilot skill or tactical innovation. But the weapon's true impact extended far beyond simple tactical effectiveness. It represented American scientific achievement applied to military necessity, demonstrating that industrial democracies could innovate faster and more effectively than totalitarian regimes when national survival demanded revolutionary solutions. Dr. Merle, Tuvey's basement laboratory in Baltimore, had created a weapon that Japanese industry could never match, widening the technological gap that would ultimately decide the Pacific War's outcome. As Japanese carriers steamed westward through the darkness, their flight decks nearly empty of operational aircraft, American task forces continued their advance toward the Philippines. The proximity fuse had cleared the skies of Japanese air power, allowing American forces to operate with impunity in waters that had once been contested by determined and skillful enemy aviators. The Demon shells had done their work with brutal efficiency, writing the final chapter of Japanese naval aviation dominance across the Pacific. The morning of June 20th brought no respite from the previous day's slaughter. Admiral Ozawa had withdrawn his battered carriers westward during the night, hoping to escape beyond American search range while assessing the devastating losses his air groups had suffered. But American reconnaissance aircraft located the Japanese fleet shortly after dawn, transmitting position reports that brought Task Force 58 racing westward at maximum speed. Admiral Mark Mitscher, commanding the American carriers, understood that decisive victory required destroying Japanese flight decks, not just their aircraft. His attack groups launched in late afternoon, racing against fading daylight to strike Ozawa's fleeing carriers before darkness made navigation impossible. The resulting engagement would demonstrate that proximity fuses had revolutionized not just defensive warfare, but the entire tactical balance between attacking aircraft and defending ships. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese combat air patrol fighters rose to meet the American strike, outnumbered but determined to protect their vulnerable carriers. The aerial combat that followed scattered both formations across miles of Pacific sky, creating the chaotic furball conditions that favored Japanese pilots' superior maneuverability and combat experience. But when American dive bombers broke through to attack Ozawa's carriers, they faced minimal anti-aircraft fire from ships that lacked Japan's equivalent to proximity-fused ammunition. Carrier Hio took 3 bomb hits that ignited aviation fuel and started uncontrollable fires. Carrier Zuikaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea, suffered 2 direct hits that destroyed her flight deck and killed dozens of crew members. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners fired desperately at attacking American aircraft, but their conventional time-fused shells achieved hit rates below 2%, allowing American pilots to press their attacks through defensive fire that posed minimal danger. The contrast with American defensive capabilities was devastating and obvious to every Japanese observer. When American ships came under attack, their proximity-fused ammunition created impenetrable barriers of exploding steel that destroyed attackers before they could release weapons. When Japanese ships faced similar threats, their conventional anti-aircraft fire achieved only marginal effectiveness, allowing American aircraft to complete attack runs with acceptable casualty rates. Captain Toshikazu Omai, serving as operations officer aboard battleship Yamato, compiled detailed after-action reports from the Philippine Sea engagement with growing recognition that Japanese naval doctrine had become obsolete overnight. His analysis revealed patterns that Japanese command staff found difficult to accept. American anti-aircraft effectiveness had increased by factors of 50 or more compared to engagements just 18 months earlier. Japanese aircraft losses per successful hit on American ships had risen from acceptable levels to rates that made offensive operations mathematically impossible. Omai's calculations were brutally simple. At current loss rates, the combined fleet would exhaust its trained aircrew within 3 months of sustained operations. Training programs could not replace experienced pilots fast enough to maintain operational strength. More critically, the psychological impact on surviving aviators was creating morale problems that no amount of propaganda could overcome. Japanese pilots, who had never hesitated to press attacks against overwhelming odds, now spoke openly about the futility of missions against American ships carrying the demon shells. The technical mystery of American proximity fuses consumed Japanese intelligence efforts throughout the summer of 1944. Fragments recovered from unexploded shells revealed vacuum tubes no larger than a man's thumb, miniaturized components that Japanese electronics manufacturers considered impossible to produce with available technology. The tubes themselves presented engineering paradoxes that violated everything Japanese scientists understood about vacuum tube construction. Standard vacuum tubes required careful handling and stable mounting to function properly. Even minor physical shocks could break the delicate filaments or crack the glass envelopes, rendering the tubes useless. Yet, American proximity fuses contained tubes that survived artillery launch accelerations of 20,000 G-forces, enough crushing pressure to reduce conventional electronics to metallic powder. Japanese engineers could not conceive of manufacturing techniques that would allow such fragile components to withstand such extreme conditions. Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, a technical intelligence officer assigned to examine captured American equipment, spent weeks analyzing shell fragments recovered from Saipan and Guam after American forces secured those islands. His laboratory in Yokosuka Naval Arsenal contained dozens of partially destroyed proximity fuses, their internal components damaged but still recognizable as sophisticated electronic assemblies far beyond Japanese manufacturing capabilities. Tanabe's reports to Naval General Staff and headquarters documented the technical specifications with professional precision. 5 miniature vacuum tubes per fuse, a spring-powered electrical generator providing power during shell flight. Radio frequency oscillators operating at frequencies Tanabe estimated around 200 MHz. Antenna systems integrated into the shell's nose cone. Battery packs using chemistry that remained functional after experiencing tremendous acceleration forces. The complete assembly weighed less than 2 pounds, yet contained more electronic complexity than Japanese military radios weighing 20 times as much. What Tanabe could not determine was how American factories produced such devices in the quantities required for fleet-wide deployment. Japanese electronics manufacturing remained largely handcrafted, with skilled technicians assembling components using techniques that had changed little since the 1930s. Mass production of precision electronic devices exceeded Japanese industrial capabilities, particularly under wartime conditions, when raw materials and skilled labor were increasingly scarce. American industry, by contrast, had transformed proximity fuse production into assembly line operations using techniques developed for automobile manufacturing and consumer electronics. Women workers in factories across the American Midwest were producing thousands of fuses daily, assembling miniature components with meticulous care, while maintaining quality standards that would have seemed impossible to Japanese observers. The industrial disparity was as decisive as the technological advantage, demonstrating that American manufacturing capacity had evolved far beyond anything Japanese planners had anticipated. The psychological impact on Japanese naval aviators exceeded even the devastating casualty statistics. Warrant Officer Kiyoshi Ogawa, a veteran dive bomber pilot with 32 combat missions, described the phenomenon in his personal diary recovered after his death during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. "We are flying into walls of exploding steel that cannot be avoided or evaded. The shells follow our aircraft through turns and altitude changes, detonating with precision that seems impossible for human gunners to achieve. My comrades speak of demons and supernatural forces, but I know the truth is worse. American technology has advanced beyond our ability to counter it through courage or skill alone." Ogawa's observations captured the fundamental shift that proximity fuses had created in naval aviation psychology. Japanese pilots had always accepted high casualty rates as necessary sacrifices for achieving decisive strikes against enemy forces. But those casualties had occurred during the final attack runs, after pilots had successfully penetrated defensive screens and positioned themselves to release weapons. Death came as the consequence of completed missions, making sacrifice meaningful within the framework of military service. Proximity-fused ammunition changed that equation completely. Japanese pilots now died during the approach phase, destroyed by defensive fire before ever reaching attack positions. Their deaths achieved nothing, contributing no damage to enemy forces and providing no tactical advantage for subsequent strikes. The futility transformed courage into waste, making continued offensive operations psychologically unbearable for aviators who understood that survival had become a matter of random chance rather than skill or determination. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and survived dozens of subsequent engagements, observed the morale collapse among Japanese carrier air groups during the months following the Philippine Sea disaster. "The men have lost faith in their ability to accomplish missions," Fuchida recorded in August 1944. "They understand that American defensive capabilities have evolved beyond anything we can overcome with available aircraft and tactics. Ordering them to continue attacks against proximity-fused ammunition is ordering them to commit suicide without purpose." Japanese Naval General Staff faced an impossible dilemma. Discontinuing offensive carrier operations would concede control of Pacific waters to American forces, allowing unrestricted movement toward the home islands. But continuing attacks meant sacrificing irreplaceable aircrew in missions that achieved minimal results while exhausting Japan's remaining aviation strength. Either choice led toward inevitable defeat, differing only in the timeline and casualty count. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commanding the combined fleet after Admiral Koga's death in March 1944, chose a desperate middle path. Japanese carriers would avoid direct engagement with American task forces while preserving their remaining air groups for a final decisive battle when opportunity presented itself. The strategy acknowledged that conventional carrier operations had become suicidal against proximity-fused defenses, while maintaining the theoretical possibility that concentrated attacks under favorable conditions might still achieve tactical success. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 demonstrated the fatal flaws in this reasoning. Japanese forces committed nearly every operational warship remaining in the combined fleet to a complex plan designed to destroy American landing forces in the Philippines. The operation required luring American carriers away from the landing beaches, while surface forces attacked the vulnerable transports and supply ships. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the decoy force, 4 carriers with barely 100 operational aircraft between them. His mission required drawing American attention while accepting near-certain destruction of his ships. The carriers had become sacrificial bait, their primary value lying not in their striking power, but in their ability to attract American forces away from more critical objectives. Admiral William Halsey took the bait, racing northward with Task Force 38 to engage Ozawa's carriers. The resulting battle off Cape Engano reprised the Philippine Sea slaughter on an even more devastating scale. American aircraft attacked Ozawa's practically defenseless carriers, while Japanese combat air patrol fighters attempted futile interceptions against overwhelming numbers. But the telling moment came when Japanese aircraft tried to strike back at Halsey's carriers. 75 Japanese aircraft attempted coordinated attacks against Task Force 38 on the morning of October 25th. American proximity-fused ammunition destroyed 68 before they could release weapons. The remaining 7 aircraft scattered, their coordinated strike broken by defensive fire that achieved better than 90% effectiveness. Not a single American carrier suffered damage from the attack. Ozawa's 4 carriers were sunk by mid-afternoon, completing the destruction of Japanese carrier aviation as an effective fighting force. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga, flying one of the few Japanese aircraft to survive the morning attack, transmitted a final radio message before his Zero ran out of fuel and crashed into the Pacific. American defenses cannot be penetrated. All aircraft lost. Tell them the demon shells have made warfare impossible. The transmission was intercepted by American radio intelligence but remained classified for decades. Its content, too, revealing of American technological advantages to risk public disclosure. The mathematical transformation of naval warfare was now complete. Japanese aircraft attempting to attack American ships faced casualty rates exceeding 90%, making mission success statistically impossible regardless of pilot skill or tactical innovation. American defensive fire had evolved from a minor inconvenience, requiring coordinated tactics to overcome, into an impenetrable barrier that destroyed everything it touched. The proximity fuse had fundamentally altered the balance between offensive air power and defensive capabilities, tipping the scales so dramatically that Japanese forces could no longer conduct effective operations. Japanese attempts to develop countermeasures proved futile. Technical intelligence had correctly identified that American shells used radio frequency detection, leading to proposals for electronic jamming equipment that might confuse or disable the fuses. But Japanese electronics industry lacked the manufacturing capacity to produce effective jamming systems in quantities sufficient for fleet-wide deployment. Prototype devices tested in late 1944 showed minimal effectiveness against proximity fuses, which used frequency-agile transmitters and sophisticated discrimination circuits that ignored most jamming attempts. More desperate proposals emerged from Japanese naval staff meetings as the war situation deteriorated. Some officers suggested abandoning daylight operations entirely, conducting all attacks during darkness when proximity fuses would have more difficulty detecting targets. But night operations required extensive training and specialized equipment that Japanese forces increasingly lacked, as experienced crews were killed faster than training programs could replace them. Others proposed using kamikaze tactics to overwhelm American defenses through sheer numbers, accepting total loss of attacking aircraft in exchange for even minimal damage to enemy ships. This approach gained favor as conventional attack methods proved increasingly suicidal without achieving tactical objectives. If pilots were going to die anyway, the reasoning went, They might as well die in attacks that guaranteed hitting their targets rather than being shot down during approach runs by demon shells they could not evade. The emergence of organized kamikaze operations in October 1944 represented Japanese acknowledgement that conventional air warfare had become impossible against American proximity-fused defenses. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, architect of the kamikaze program, explicitly cited American anti-aircraft effectiveness as justification for suicide tactics. Ordinary attacks have become futile. Onishi told his pilots at Mabalacat airfield on October 19th, "Only by crashing into enemy ships can we guarantee hitting our targets." But even kamikaze attacks faced devastating attrition from proximity-fused ammunition. American gunners discovered that the fuses worked equally well against aircraft flying directly toward their ships, creating barriers of exploding steel that destroyed suicide planes before they could complete their dives. Statistical analysis of kamikaze operations showed that proximity-fused defenses achieved kill rates above 80% against suicide attackers, far exceeding the effectiveness of conventional ammunition against similar targets. Ensign Teruo Yamaguchi flew his Zero in a kamikaze attack against American carriers off Okinawa on April 12, 1945. His final moments, reconstructed from American combat reports and Japanese radio intercepts, illustrated the brutal effectiveness of proximity-fused defenses against even the most determined attacks. Yamaguchi's aircraft approached USS Enterprise at 300 miles per hour in a steep dive calculated to minimize exposure to defensive fire. American 5-inch guns opened fire at 8,000 yards, their proximity-fused shells creating a curtain of explosions directly in his flight path. The first shell detonated 70 feet from Yamaguchi's Zero at an altitude of 4,000 feet, shredding his port wing and destroying his hydraulic system. The damaged aircraft continued downward, its pilot dead or unconscious from shrapnel wounds, until a second proximity-fused shell exploded directly beneath the fuselage at 2,000 feet. The Zero disintegrated instantly, its fragments scattering across empty ocean far from Enterprise's armored hull. The entire engagement lasted less than 30 seconds from first shell fired to target destroyed. American combat reports from Okinawa documented similar results across thousands of kamikaze attacks. Proximity-fused ammunition achieved effectiveness rates that made even suicide tactics largely futile against well-defended ships. Japanese forces lost over 4,000 aircraft during the Okinawa campaign while sinking fewer than 30 American vessels, an exchange rate that demonstrated how completely proximity fuses had shifted the tactical balance in favor of defensive fire. Captain Rikihei Inoguchi, senior staff officer for Japanese kamikaze operations, compiled detailed analysis of attack results during the final months of the war. His classified report to Naval General Staff Headquarters acknowledged that American anti-aircraft capabilities had rendered conventional warfare obsolete. Enemy defensive fire achieves destruction rates that make organized attacks impossible to sustain. Our pilots die before reaching their targets. The demon shells have made the sky itself our enemy. The industrial dimension of America's proximity fuse advantage grew more pronounced as the war continued. By early 1945, American factories were producing over 2 million fuses monthly, supplying both Pacific and European theaters with virtually unlimited quantities of the revolutionary ammunition. Every major American warship carried proximity-fused shells as standard ordnance, while land-based anti-aircraft batteries defending strategic installations received similar supplies. Japanese intelligence officers monitoring American industrial output recognized the staggering disparity. While Japanese factories struggled to produce adequate quantities of conventional ammunition, American industry was mass manufacturing electronic devices, more complex than Japanese military radios. The proximity fuse represented not just technological superiority, but industrial capacity that Japanese manufacturing could never match under any circumstances. Lieutenant Commander Haruki Iki, attached to the Naval Technical Research Institute in Tokyo, summarized the situation in a report submitted days before Japan's surrender. American proximity fuses embody manufacturing capabilities that exceed our industrial potential by orders of magnitude. Each shell contains electronic components we cannot produce in laboratory conditions, yet American factories manufacture them by millions, using assembly line techniques we do not possess. The technological gap has become so vast that Japanese industry would require decades to achieve equivalent capabilities, assuming access to American manufacturing knowledge and unrestricted raw materials. The human cost of this technological revolution appeared in Japanese casualty statistics that told their own brutal story. Naval aviation losses in 1944 exceeded all previous years combined, with experienced aircrew dying faster than training programs could replace them. By early 1945, Japanese carrier air groups existed largely on paper, their assigned aircraft scattered across land bases throughout the Pacific, while ships sailed without adequate defensive capabilities. The psychological cost was equally devastating. Japanese aviators who survived multiple encounters with proximity-fused ammunition often suffered from what modern medicine would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, displaying symptoms of extreme anxiety and survivor guilt that made continued combat operations impossible. Medical officers at naval hospitals reported increasing numbers of pilots unable to fly due to psychological trauma, induced by repeated exposure to defensive fire they could neither predict nor evade. Warrant Officer Saburo Sakai, who survived the Philippine Sea battle and continued flying missions until war's end, later described the psychological impact in his memoirs. "We were fighting against weapons we could not see or understand. The shells exploded around us with supernatural precision, killing our comrades without warning or mercy. Many pilots spoke of divine punishment or demonic forces, unable to accept that human technology could achieve such devastating accuracy. I knew the truth was simpler and more terrible. American science had advanced beyond our ability to counter it, making our courage and skill irrelevant against weapons that thought faster than we could react." The final months of the war saw Japanese naval aviation reduced to scattered remnants conducting desperate attacks against overwhelming American superiority. Proximity-fused ammunition had achieved what years of conventional warfare could not, destroying Japanese air power so completely that organized resistance became impossible. By August 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed fewer than 500 operational aircraft, most of them scattered across isolated bases with insufficient fuel or spare parts to conduct sustained operations. Admiral Matome Ugaki, commander of the 5th Air Fleet, led the final kamikaze mission on August 15, 1945, hours after Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. Ugaki's force consisted of 11 aircraft attacking American ships off Okinawa in a final gesture of defiance against inevitable defeat. American proximity-fused ammunition destroyed all 11 aircraft before they could reach their targets, providing a fitting epitaph for Japanese naval aviation's futile struggle against American technological superiority. The proximity fuse's impact extended far beyond its tactical effectiveness. It demonstrated that modern warfare had evolved into a contest of industrial capacity and scientific innovation as much as military courage or strategic genius. Japanese forces had fought with determination and skill throughout the Pacific War, but those qualities could not overcome American ability to mass-produce weapons that Japanese industry could barely comprehend, let alone duplicate. Dr. Merle Tuvey's seemingly impossible idea, building miniature radar sets that could survive being shot from cannons, had fundamentally altered the course of the Pacific War. His basement laboratory at Johns Hopkins had created a weapon that Japanese forces came to fear more than American carriers, submarines, or strategic bombers. The Demon shells had made the sky itself lethal to Japanese aircraft, transforming American defensive capabilities from marginal effectiveness into near-absolute dominance. The mathematical transformation was staggering. At Pearl Harbor in December 1941, American anti-aircraft fire achieved 0 confirmed kills against attacking Japanese aircraft, despite firing 1,400 rounds. By Okinawa in April 1945, American gunners were destroying over 80% of attacking aircraft while consuming fewer shells per kill than had been fired in the entire Pearl Harbor engagement. The improvement represented a 5,000-fold increase in effectiveness, achieved through a single technological innovation that Japanese forces could neither counter nor replicate. Japanese naval officers who survived the war and later studied American proximity fuse technology expressed a mixture of admiration and resignation regarding the weapon that had destroyed their air power. Captain Toshikazu Omai, in his post-war writings, acknowledged that Japanese intelligence had completely failed to anticipate American technological capabilities. "We knew Americans possessed industrial advantages, but we believed Japanese fighting spirit and tactical skill would overcome material disparities. The proximity fuse demonstrated our fundamental error. Modern warfare rewards scientific innovation and manufacturing capacity more than courage or tradition." The legacy of American proximity fuses extended far beyond World War II's conclusion. The vacuum tube miniaturization techniques developed for artillery shells became the foundation for post-war electronics advancement. The precision manufacturing methods required for mass-producing complex electronic devices enabled the consumer electronics revolution that transformed global society in subsequent decades. The tiny radar transmitters that had hunted Japanese aircraft through Pacific skies led directly to transistors, integrated circuits, and eventually the microprocessors that powered the digital age. But for the Imperial Japanese Navy, the proximity fuse represented something simpler and more immediate. It was the weapon that made warfare impossible, destroying aircraft with mathematical precision that rendered courage irrelevant and tactics obsolete. Japanese aviators had entered the Pacific War, confident in their training and determined to defend their nation through skill and sacrifice. They emerged from the conflict, those few who survived, understanding that technological superiority had made their sacrifice meaningless and their determination futile against weapons that could think faster than human reflexes could react. The Demon shells had achieved what no amount of conventional firepower could accomplish. They had cleared the Pacific skies of Japanese air power, allowing American forces to advance toward the home islands with impunity. In doing so, they had demonstrated a fundamental truth about modern warfare that would shape military development for generations. Victory belonged not to the bravest soldiers or most skilled pilots, but to the nations whose scientists could transform impossible ideas into weapons that rewrote the rules of combat entirely. As the sun set over the Pacific on August 15, 1945, the last Japanese carrier aircraft attempted their final mission against American forces that no longer needed to fear them. Proximity-fused ammunition destroyed those aircraft with the same mathematical precision that had devastated Japanese naval aviation throughout 3 years of desperate combat. The Demon shells had done their work thoroughly, writing the final chapter of Japanese naval air power in explosions that followed aircraft through the sky with inhuman accuracy. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had marked the beginning of the end. The Demon shells had ensured that end came with mechanical inevitability, destroying Japanese aircraft faster than Japanese industry could build them, and killing Japanese pilots faster than training programs could replace them. American science had achieved what American courage alone could never accomplish, creating weapons that made the sky itself lethal to Japanese forces and transforming defensive fire into an absolute barrier that conventional tactics could not penetrate. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.